And I've so much energy, and maybe it's because I'm not recording this at 11 p.m. So maybe I should start doing this in the middle of the day. Anyways, what is going on, everybody? Welcome back to another episode of Bug of the Week. And on this episode of our journey through the insect orders, we have arrived at Zoraptera, otherwise known as the angel insects. So the angel insects, Zoraptera, are this very small order of insects. Only about 30 or so species are described so far, and they're a super little known order. Like, very few people know about them. I didn't know about them until recently, and they're really cool, really charismatic, and although they don't really look like anything special, they have a lot of interesting behaviors. So there's actually a lot of misconceptions about the angel insects. First of all, with its name, Zoraptera. So a fun fact, with insect orders and kind of words in general, the etymology of entomology for this name is interesting, because if an order ends with optera, so like what we talked about last week, the ephemeroptera, if it ends with optera, that means they have wings. And if it ends with aptera, it means they do not have wings. So you might be thinking, well, Braden, why is that weird? I mean, this picture, they don't have wings. And that is because angel insects often do have wings, and their wings are really interesting looking. They kind of look like angel wings, right? But the reason that they were named with Aptera is because when they were first discovered, they didn't think they had wings, because winged Zorapterans are very rare. So angel insects in general are very rare, sort of hard to come by. They're very small, only 2 to 3 millimeters in length. They're very, very small insects, and so people don't find them very often, let alone finding one with wings. That's where the behavior of the angel insects gets interesting, is because sometimes they have wings, sometimes they don't. I'll talk about that a little bit more when we get to their behavior, but let's get their anatomy out of the way first. So, angel insects are very small, cryptic looking insects. You oftentimes don't notice them. They're oftentimes unpigmented, although there are these brown ones. And taxonomically, they're a little bit of a touchy subject. We're not sure quite where they fit. A lot of people think they're closer related to Dermaptera, which are the earwigs. A lot of people think they are more closely to the group that includes mantises, roaches, and other things like that. And so we're really not sure quite where they fit on the phylogeny, because they kind of look like a combination of a bunch of different things. So yeah, cryptic, hardly noticeable usually, but some identifying features that I'm going to point out are their sort of triangular shaped head and their maniliform antennae, which means that they are beaded antennae. I think they're pretty cute. Another noticeable feature is they're very, very small, 1 or 2 segmented cerci. So they have these little nubbins on the end of their abdomens, and yes, those are cerci. We've talked about cerci a lot, and they're highly reduced in the angel insects. So the other 2 orders that we've talked about previously that have wings, the Odonata and the Ephemeroptera, I mentioned in those videos that they have these things called direct flight muscles. But for the Zorapterans that have wings, they are the first lineage in the insects that have indirect flight muscles. So I figured this episode would be good to talk about the difference between indirect versus direct flight muscles. So like I mentioned in those episodes with the direct flight muscles, the muscles inside the thorax are directly attached to the base of the wings, which makes them very fast, very responsive, and, really good flyers. But the major drawback is the metabolic cost. So they're very expensive to make, maintain, and power. That's where indirect flight muscles came in, and they remain for the rest of the insects. So starting with Zoraptera and the rest of the insects we're going to talk about in this series all have indirect flight muscles. So with indirect flight muscles, instead of attaching to the base of the wing, indirect flight muscles attach to the thorax. The muscle basically stretches from one end of the thorax to the top of the thorax, and when the muscles contract, they flex the thorax in a kind of a pinching motion, and that is what flaps the wing. It takes less power, less energy. They are much more efficient, and so the insects with the indirect flight muscles are much more energetically reliable. They live much longer typically, and it's just sort of a more efficient system. Other than that, the anatomy of them are pretty generic. Here's a winged one if you're interested. Their wings are quite long, dainty, feather-like wings, which I think are very cool looking. Kind of an iridescent color sometimes. But other than that, the anatomy of the angel insects are nothing flashy, nothing crazy. So understandably, angel insects often get confused with termites. How would you tell an angel insect apart from a termite? First of all, termites are a lot larger. Even the workers of termites are much larger than angel insects. So that's number one. Number two, I will say their head shape, like I mentioned, is sort of a triangular shaped, whereas with termites, their heads are much more round and bulbous shaped. Also, termites are often in very, very large colonies, whereas Zorapteras are not in colonies. But that's a good segue to their behavior. This becomes a reoccurring theme in the rest of the insects. But Zorapterans are the first insects that I've talked about so far that exhibit some level of sociality. So sociality is this broad term that is always changing in the field, but sort of the agreed upon definition of sociality is two members of the same species working cooperatively in a manner that extends beyond courtship and mating. So two members of the same species are cooperating in some way, but not for the purposes of reproduction. So Zoraptera are the first example of this, and Zorapterans have seen to exhibit some level of communalism, meaning they will live in close proximity to one another in sort of a colony. I won't say structure because it's not structured in any way, but sort of a communal nesting place. So for Zorapterans, it's typically in a rotting log or inside of bark or in a stump where 50 to 100 individuals can live in a sort of colonial structure. And I would say rather than a colony like an ant or a bee, I would say it's more like a housing complex or an apartment building where you have roommates and neighbors, but you don't really cooperate in any way. So you sort of all live in the same structure, but there is no cooperation, and maybe it's even less structure than an apartment building because there's not really a lot of evidence that they even communicate or recognize each other in any way. So you could take some angel insects from the leaf litter or the soil and find a colony, put those ones next to or in the colony, and the existing members wouldn't really pay any notice or aggression to them, where compared to a lot of the other social insects that we'll get into later down the series, there's a lot of territorial aggression with a lot of those social insects. So that's sort of our first introduction into insect sociality, and that is communal living. So they just live together. They don't really do anything together. They just live there. And this is quite common if insects live in a structured environment. So they like to live in a niche, specific, structured nest. You will often see this happen with many other insects that live in a specific home. But this is not where the interesting behaviors of the angel insects end. There's also a lot of male competition. And so males will actually fight each other. They'll sort of headbutt each other, grapple each other to sort of win over females. And this is kind of a recurring theme in a lot of insects and really animals in general, is a lot of the structures on males are often to either attract females or fight with males to attract females. And Zorapterans are no exceptions. They don't really have a dedicated structure or a horn or anything that a lot of other male insects might have, but they definitely have the behavioral aspect of that, where they will fight each other for territory or for females, and it's quite interesting to see. So I mentioned these guys live in wood. Well, what do they eat? They don't eat the wood. That's actually a very rare thing. Very few animals or even insects will eat wood. So I mentioned that angel insects are very, very small. And to put that into perspective, angel insects mostly feed on fungal spores, which are tiny. Angel insects will feed on fungal spores, decaying plant matter. Detritus is the term for that. And in some cases, even small arthropods, like the springtails, the collembolans that I've talked about before. So yeah, they will feed on a range of things, mostly detritivores though. These insects are also another group in the hemimetabolous insects, meaning they have a 3-stage metamorphosis, being egg, nymph, and adult. So they go through a series of molts until they reach adulthood, developing their reproductive organs. We've been over this, pretty basic metamorphosis for them. Angel insects are very important for nutrient cycling. They're important decomposers. Like I said, they feed on decaying plant matter and things of that nature. So they're important for nutrient cycling in our environment, and they don't negatively affect humans in any way. And in fact, a lot of people don't even know that they exist. So it's always very cool that I can highlight these interesting bugs that a lot of people don't know about and that I didn't know about a couple minutes ago. So yeah, I tried to fill this video with as much information as I could find for you guys because these are really unappreciated, rarely noticed insects, and I like to highlight those kinds of bugs. So with that, I hope you all enjoyed this episode. If you did, definitely leave us a like and subscribe. Comment if I missed anything or if you've ever heard of angel insects, maybe your favorite fact about them. They're very cute, very charismatic little bugs. But that is about it for this episode. Next week, we are covering Dermaptera, which are the earwigs, which are super fun. Lots to talk about with those guys. So definitely subscribe if you don't want to miss that one. But with that, I will see you all next week. But until then, keep on bugging. See ya.